Evening, guys. We're going to get started here after several comments, mostly from my wife. I'm going to try this a little bit different, and by different, I mean from a different angle. Uh, we'll see how that goes. I am, let's see if we get closer. There we go. All right. So this is up on top of my desk and everything, and you're going to see me looking down at my computer a lot more as I'm reading through the text and whatnot, but I hope you can hear me. Can't be too loud. I'm inside. Kids are all in bed, so we're gonna try to let them sleep. But they've been asleep for a little while, so hopefully they'll stay that way. Um, if you are joining us live and you're listening in and you have trouble hearing me, I'll see those comments. Let me know, and I'll try to speak up because I really want these to be able to be heard. Got the dishwasher going in the background, and I'm consider turning it off, but I really need those dishes done too before I go to bed. So yeah, definitely bedtime. It's nice, peaceful, get stuff done, right? So welcome tonight. We're continuing with the analysis of the 2018 biology textbook adopted by Clay County, and we're still in chapter 10. We're still talking about Darwin and his journey to error aboard the Beagle, and all the things that he arrived at conclusion-wise, why he arrived at it, and why some of the things that the book is presenting is wrong. Oh, good. That's good to hear. This phone's pretty good. I like the audio on this. It's a Galaxy S7 or Edge or something like that, and it's been a pretty good quality phone. So anyway. We're on page 294 in the textbook, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it, and then we'll comment on that. Welcome aboard, Tom. Let's see here. It says at the top of the page, Darwin reasoned that, and this is talking about resources from the previous page, the limited amount of resources and whatnot. So Darwin reasoned that similar struggles took place in nature. If resources are limited and organisms have more offspring than could survive, why do some individuals and not others survive? So, again, the analysis of natural selection is that natural selection itself is not necessarily wrong. It's demonstrable. It's something that can easily be shown. I don't have any problems with the idea of natural selection. I have a couple of issues with the way that it's worded. Even the idea of selection, I think, is a bad word to describe it, because it's a passive thing. It's not an active thing. Nature's not out there going, you get to survive and you don't. It's just how the environment is and how the animals find it and can they survive in it. So I don't have any problems with natural selection. So this part of it with the resources, I really don't have any problems with it. But where Darwin takes it is where I'm going to have problems tonight. So he says Darwin found his answer in the variation he had seen within population. And a population is all the individuals of a species. That word species is very important. All the population that live in an area. And so he goes on and he talks about the variations that he found on the Galapagos Islands between the tortoises, the finches, and some other things. And he proposed that those were actually different populations, different species. And my question is, and this is the first major question of the night, is how does he know that those different populations couldn't interbreed? Is there something about a finch's beak that keeps it from breeding with other finches? And if they can interbreed and produce viable offspring that can then breed, that fits the evolutionist definition of species, and it destroys the idea that these finches and these tortoises showed evolution taking place, because you had finches and you had more finches and there were some finches over there and there were finches all over the place, and now you have finches. Well, that's not evolution. That's not a change from one kind of creature into another, which is what evolution ultimately alleges. It's just finches. Same thing with the tortoises, one with a higher shell, one with a lower shell. And I'm aware of the idea of the ring species and all of that. That's not here on this page, so I'm not going to get into that tonight. But when you talk about these things, and you talk about these adaptations, there's specific adaptations that would preclude breeding with one another. And I'll just give you an example. There's no way that some dog like a Mastiff is going to breed with a Chihuahua in any kind of natural sense. Now, we can artificially inseminate them, and we can get a crossbreed out of that. I don't recommend it, but we can do it. But I don't know that there is enough evidence here to draw the conclusion that Darwin wanted to draw. And the reason I bring it up is to show that Darwin had an idea that he was trying to prove, and he was kind of grasping for it. And the evidence didn't warrant the conclusion that he was grasping for. So there were some things, and we're going to see here when we get into some of these other terms, that's what he was doing, because they don't work. So anyway, some of the things that are said here, he proposed that these adaptations arose over many generations. And I touched on this in another video, that number one, adaptations, and I've talked about that a number of times. Adaptations are only from material that already exists. It's already in the genome, and is therefore not really the type of evolution that the evolutionists are pushing. Adaptation doesn't have anything to do with this rocks to man evolution. It's not a driver for it. It doesn't participate in it. There's nothing related to it specifically as adaptation. These variations are like, I was born with blonde hair. Somebody else might be born with very dark hair, and so those are differences in our genomes. Those are variations within the human race. If I had married a woman with a very dark hair, then our kids might have been born blonde, might have been born with dark hair, because both of those were available already in the genome. And so that's adaptation and variation, and it has nothing to do with the idea of creating new types or new kinds of creatures. It's still within the same kind of creature. So that's a huge difference, I think, in the way that the information is presented, both by Darwin and by the biology textbook. And so he proposed these adaptations arose over many generations, which that brings into question the survivability. If a change, a variation required multiple generations to catch hold, well, how is that really survivable? How is that talking about survivability? Because between generation A and generation Z, which is the one that was supposed to be the survival of the fittest, what was going on in the environment, what was going on with all of the generations in between? It's not happening fast enough. And the other thing is, Darwin called this process of evolution descent with modification, and that's important because now we're getting into this idea of descent and the common descent of all creatures, which is where this is headed. The common descent is the core of evolution. That is absolutely false. So over on the side, the reading toolbox vocabulary, the term descent is used in evolution to mean the passing of genetic information from generation to generation, and in the grand scheme of things, it's all the generations, from the very first living thing that magically appeared to all of the living things now. That's really where this is headed, is that common descent. All right, so headed down to the bottom of the page, and this is going to be the meat of our conversation. I guess not conversation if I'm the only one participating, but our talk tonight. We're at the bottom of page 294, and Charles Darwin was not the only person to develop a theory. It's a hypothesis. It's not a theory. It's the wrong use of the word. He developed a hypothesis And then here they go with this idea of explanation, theories explain, and whatever, but a hypothesis is just a simple statement. And then suddenly it blooms into a theory, which is this big, flowery umbrella thing that explains everything. And then we go back to law, which is just a little tiny thing. And there's a disconnect there between those three words that modern science is trying to, I honestly believe they're actively trying to cover it up. But maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist. That's not going to be the first time I've been accused of that. So, anyway, Charles Darwin was not the only person to develop a hypothesis, is my word, theory is their word, to explain how evolution may take place. Okay, and that may is not to say that evolution doesn't take place. It's to admit that they didn't know in Darwin's day exactly how it took place. Because remember, this is pre-genetics. Genetics is not in the picture yet. Nobody knows anything about genotype. They don't know anything about alleles. They don't know anything about ACT and G. None of that. Chromosomes, that's not yet. Okay, it was coming, but it wasn't yet. And so he's trying to talk about all this without actually dealing with it. I honestly wish we had gotten to genetics before we had tried out evolution as a hypothesis, because I think if we had started with genetics, somebody would have come along and said, yeah, but evolution, and people would have laughed at them because it doesn't make any sense. But since we got them reversed, they've tried to shoehorn it in, and so now biology is just a huge mess in the last 30, 40 years. So you had an English naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace independently developed a hypothesis, is my word, very similar to Darwin's. Both Darwin and Wallace had studied the huge diversity of plants and animals in the tropics, and both had studied the fossil record. Okay, so now we're getting into this fossil. That's one of those pillars of evolution. And I've already talked about it briefly. I'll come back to it because the book does. In 1858, the ideas of Darwin and Wallace were presented to an important group of scientists in London. The next year, Darwin published his idea on the origin of species by means of natural selection, and we cut off the title right there because we don't want everybody to realize that Darwin was a racist jerk. So they don't even present that. Don't know why. Honesty, history is history. Why don't you present the full, especially here, this is the main introduction of his work on the origin of species. We just truncate it to origin of species, but it's about the survival of those favored races of humankind. The whites are superior to blacks. Why can't you put that in here? Oh, because it doesn't fit your narrative? I understand. Alright, then it gets into the four main principles to the idea of natural selection. They say theory of natural selection. I don't like their use of the word theory, so I'm kind of editing. I'll post up these pages as they are, and so you can read for yourself and know that I'm not trying to pull something fast here. But there are four main principles to the theory of natural selection: variation, overproduction, adaptation, and descent with modification. Now, up to this point, the book has talked about variation and adaptation kind of as synonyms and presented them in a way that isn't necessarily wrong. There is variation within species. There is adaptation as certain genes express themselves and certain are recessive, and that's not a problem. But here they're going to slip one in on us, and this is how they do it. It's this incrementalism where they start bringing in these other ideas, and the kids don't know any better. They aren't analyzing it the way that I am doing it, the way that adults should be doing it. And so when they slip these little things in, then later on they bring it back and back when we mentioned it the first time, and it's already in their mind. So this is where we get into some of this stuff. Variation. The heritable differences or variations that exist in every population are the basis for natural selection. Okay, we'll let that lie. The differences among individuals result from differences in the genetic material of the organism, whether inherited from a parent. No problem there. I don't have any issue with the differences being inherited. This is going back to the breeding of dogs, or humans that marry another human that have a different trait, red hair or black hair, or darker skin, lighter skin, or tall, short, whatever. Um, that's variation. It's easy to demonstrate. But then here they slip it in. The differences among individuals result from differences in the genetic material of the organism, whether inherited from a parent or resulting from a genetic mutation. Bam, there it is. Genetic mutation. This is another one of those pillars of evolution that they just assert is the primary driver. Genetic mutation. And so variation, then they can talk about it and they can talk about, hey, look, we can show variation all the time. Look at all of the different creatures about that have they're the same thing, but they have all these differences. Oh, a genetic mutation. And then that's where they get the kids to start believing, is because it's this little subtle introduction, and they don't explain it here. There's no definition. They don't talk about genetic mutation. There's nothing other than the mention of this genetic mutation, and we're supposed to just accept that variation is something that happens in a beneficial way to help survival of the fittest because of natural selection. And so, very important part. Overproduction, while having many offspring raises the chance that some will survive, it also results in competition between offspring for resources. And so, since they're competing with each other for these resources, the ones that can compete better are the ones that survive. That's the whole natural selection thing. And then they have adaptation actually listed here as something separate than variation. I kind of understand why they did it, but the variation and adaptation are essentially two sides of the same coin. Sometimes a certain variation, see there it is, allows an individual to survive better than other individuals. It competes against its environment. The most successful individuals are considered naturally selected to live longer and to provide more offspring that share these adaptations for their environment. So the ones that have the beneficial adaptation survive longer to reproduce more offspring. And there's a quote that I have. I guess I should have pulled it up tonight, but it talks about that there really isn't anything more to evolution and survival of the fittest than a circular argument. It's that the fit survive to reproduce, and there isn't anything more to it than that. They reproduce, they survive, and then they reproduce more. And there isn't anything. Sorry, I got a bug in here that's annoying me, but there isn't anything more to it than that. That there is the survival of the fittest to survive, and then they reproduce more of the same that are able to survive, but they don't ever talk about how they got to be the survival, or how they got to be the fittest in the first place. That's where this genetic mutation gets slipped in. And that's a very important point. If you can take away genetic mutation, if all you're left with is the genes that were already as part of that kind of creature, then evolution is gone. There is no evolution that can take place in a meaningful way. You wouldn't be able to call it evolution, because everybody knows that when you say evolution, you're actually talking about common descent. You're actually talking about the rocks to man evolution. And so that take any one of these pillars out, and it's gone. And I've already in my first videos back in the spring, when I started up the Science Freedom Florida stuff, I already took away the pillar of time. The universe, the physics behind it just doesn't allow for it. But I can take away the genetic mutation one. I can take away the fossil record, the radiometric dating. We can address all of those, and we can take away those pillars. But here, all the book is doing is introducing those. So, all right, and then the last one is descent with modification. Over time, natural selection will result in species with adaptations that are well suited for survival and reproduction in an environment. More individuals will have the trait in every following generation, as long as the environmental conditions continue to remain beneficial for the trait. And so all of this comes together under the umbrella of natural selection, and says, therefore, everything came from a single-celled organism millions of years ago in a pool of slime somewhere. And here we are, all of this complexity and diversity of life. And it all hinges on that genetic mutation. It's just two little words on the whole page. And if you take that away, then they don't have a case at all. And then they get into jaguars, which is cool. I mean, who doesn't like big cats? I'm a cat person myself. Dogs are kind of drooly. They're cute and fun to play with, but I'm more of a cat person. And so I like big cats. They're cool to study and whatever. But what's funny to me is that they're trying to make a particular point. They're trying to say rocks to man evolution, and what they're showing is jaguar to jaguar small changes that don't give us what they're claiming. A jaguar is a jaguar is a jaguar, and jaguars are always going to be big cats. Now, I don't have a problem with jaguars interbreeding with lions and tigers and all the other big cats, and we can just group them all together as I would even say different breeds, but if you want to call them species, that's fine too. But they're cats, and you're never going to get a non-cat out of them, and you can't trace their lineage back to something that wasn't a cat. There's nothing in the fossil record that takes cats back, and then suddenly we know this is an ancestor of the cats, but it's not a cat. There's nothing like that that exists in the fossil record. And that's true of every kind of animal that exists. You can look at the fossil record and you can see similarities, like the glyptodon and the armadillo. We saw some similarities there, and we can look at the maybe even the ceratops and the rhinoceros, if you want to go that far. There are similarities that are obvious. What's not obvious is when you get outside of those phenotype similarities, there's a clean break, and they even talk about it. They talk about the Cambrian explosion, and they talk about punctuated equilibrium, and suddenly there's just all of this life, and they're like, it came upon us so fast, there's just not enough fossils to show, and so we have to assume, and then since we're assuming to you, we have to assert, and you just should accept it because we're all scientists and you're not. And that's what evolution really boils down to. But show me going back in this alleged fossil history of big cats where they weren't big cats, or cats in general, because domesticated cats I can lump in with that. But show me in the history where they were demonstrably anything but a cat. And there was a debate that Dr. Thomas Warren and Anthony G. and Flew, or Anthony, he didn't have an H in there, Anthony G. and Flew had back in the 70s that addressed this. And Dr. Warren's argument was powerful. He said there's only two ways that humans arrived here through evolution. Either a non-human gave birth to a human, or a non-human turned into a human over the course of its life. Those are the only two ways. And of course he had asked some questions prior to the debate, and he demonstrated that Dr. Flew denied both of those. Well, there's no other logical possibility. You can't get from non-human to human any other way. And that's true of every kind of creature that's on the planet. Is if you have that which is not, and then that gives rise to that which is, there's only two ways to do it biologically. Either they transformed over the course of their life, their genes changed while they were yet alive, which this biology textbook actually says is not true, or that which wasn't gave birth to that which was, which is what genetic mutation is all about. But when you get into the specifics and when you define your terms precisely, the biologists will deny that too. They will deny that there was ever, it happened over such long periods of time, that it's just all of these shades of gray. It's like 50 shades of gray in evolution. And they can't show it. They just have to assert it because it doesn't exist. There's no evidence that kind of transition from not to is ever happened, and so they have nothing. So anyway, you can read up. I don't want to belabor the point on. They talk about slight differences in teeth, the slight differences in jaw size, and I'm thinking to myself, this is a kind of a Vern Troyer, Shaquille O'Neal. That's my common example all the time. But the example of these differences are so slight, they're so small, for us to then extrapolate out to something that wasn't a jaguar or wasn't a cat became a cat, and then that branched out into the jaguars and lions and tigers and all that. They don't have any evidence for it, and science is about evidence. Science about being able to demonstrate it, either through explicit show you here it is kind of thing, like dropping a pin to demonstrate gravity, or to have evidence that implies it, and it has to be an implication that there's no other conclusion that's possible. There's nothing like that in what we're presented with in regards to evolution. It's all assertion. And if you've been following me through this whole analysis, you can just go back through all these videos all the way back to the beginning of the analysis of the textbook, and they still haven't presented any actual evidence at all. There's nothing here that actually says, oh look, this is why we can say common descent. This is why we can say that evolution means that we started off as a bunch of chemicals in a pool somewhere and got together and became a cell, and then bam, here's all the life on Earth today. They don't ever show that. They can't show that because that evidence does not exist. There's nowhere that evidence exists. So, all right, well, that's all I got for tonight. Thank you guys for tuning in. Had a lot of people that were hopping on, hopping off, and I appreciate that. As always, if you have any questions, you want to have a conversation about this, you're welcome to post comments in the section underneath the video. I'll respond as I have time. This needs to be civil discourse. It's one of the things that I'm teaching at my new school, civil discourse. This needs to stay on topic. This is not about personalities. This is not about egos. This is not about attacking you. I'm not going to say anything about you if you disagree with me. Now I'm gonna attack your hypothesis. I'm gonna attack your premises. But we're gonna keep this civil in the comments. Look forward to any discussion or conversation that you want to have in the comments. Please share this. Send this out to as many people that you think would benefit from it. And as always, keep learning. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.